Welcome to the Oneness Movement for Humanity. Our collective destiny is glorious. Let's work together.
Hi everyone, my name is Mit Gopal. Today's podcast is a reading from my book, Preserving Oneness of Humanity. The title is The Power of Forgiveness. One of the greatest obstacles to the oneness of humanity is the difficulty to forgive. Throughout the ages, how often have the most vulnerable suffered atrocities? Some victims of the recent social injustices and their descendants are still alive. The persecutions from ages gone by have been well documented and passed through many generations. Recent humiliation, carnage, and ethnic cleansings involved the Jews during Second World War, the Rohingyas in Myanmar, the indigenous populations on every continent, and the Dalits, called the Untouchables, in India. These are only a few accounts of the dehumanization of marginalized segments of humanity around the world recorded in history. The question remains how these oppressed people can reconcile with the broader population of the nation where they live. Carrying the burden of the past trauma, they need to move forward. This is such a vast and complicated issue that would baffle anyone as to where to begin. I start with a subject I am somewhat familiar with. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, was set up with a mandate to inform all Canadians about what happened in Indian residential schools, IRS. What is IRS? Briefly, residential schools were government-sponsored religious learning centers established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. The first residential facilities were established in New France, now called Canada. The term usually refers to the custodial schools established after 1880. The purpose of this institution was to eliminate all aspects of Aboriginal culture. Students had their hair cut short, they were dressed in uniforms, and their days were strictly regimented by timetables. The last residential school operated by the Canadian government, Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan, was closed in 1996. Many former residential school students are still alive, living with the scars of an oppressive program. In 2012, the TRC, led by Senator Sinclair, issued 94 calls for action to many levels of government to address social, judicial, health, treaty, and other issues related to the indigenous population of Canada. The report also recommended that the churches, since the Catholic churches were directly involved, educate their congregations about respect for the Aboriginal cultures and recognition of the suffering endured by many of the Indian residential schools. Many of the victims still have to deal with the process of healing from the decades-long trauma experienced by their children, the parents, and the families involved. Some survivors still recall the abuses with raw wounds that will take a long time to heal. When the pain is too hard to bear to move forward, survivors look for answers. After any trauma, two choices become obvious. One, anger with revenge, and two, make peace with the past through forgiveness. The Charles Bronson approach to solving problems always lead to more suffering, but the latter take us to true reconciliation. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness is the intentional and voluntary process by which a victim undergoes a change in feelings and attitude regarding an offense. In doing so, a pardon for the offender's actions replaces negative emotions such as vengefulness, betrayal, anger, and fear. In such an ordeal, it helps to remember that we all have screwed up at one time or another. In any relationship, mistakes, whether they're biggies or not so biggies, happen. As much as we are all flawed human beings, our inner selves also yearn for forgiveness, because knowing and accepting that we have hurt someone is in itself a punishment. To salvage a ruined relationship between individuals and ethnic groups and avoid bitterness and resentment, forgiveness can provide true reconciliation. Let's be clear on what forgiveness is and isn't. To forgive does not mean that you condone wrongdoing. Reaching a place of true forgiveness is not about you deciding that what someone did is okay if it wasn't. Forgiveness does not mean that you have to forget. Is that even possible? Forgiveness is eliminating the negativity that results from hurt by letting go of emotional baggage. In some ways, forgiveness is comforting and powerful, but it is rarely meant for others. Rather, it is for self-preservation and healing. For example, those who scooped up children from their parents in Canada are all gone, but the stories remain and the hurt continues. Let's be also clear that forgiveness is not always easy to accomplish. English poet Alexander Pope once said, "To err is human, to forgive divine." As we are prone to make mistakes, some of us also know that God is the ultimate dispenser of pardons. We hope that when we face our Maker, the forgiveness of our mistakes will be forthcoming through divine grace. If forgiveness happens in addition to reconciliation, it is true empowerment, enabling one to move forward beyond the oppression of negative emotions. Here are some benefits. Forgiveness is a source of growth and happiness. On the other hand, holding hurt, resentments, pain, and anger means poison to the self. Forgiveness banishes the ghosts of the past and frees us to live in the present without missing today's beauty. As Confucius said about revenge, before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. Living actively with anger and seeking revenge is inviting death with 1,000 cuts. Forgiveness releases personal power. Holding anger, regret, hatred, or resentment towards someone means surrendering our divine powers to that person. The only way to break away from this bondage is to forgive, not necessarily forget. Forgiveness brings the good fortune of spiritual, emotional, and physical health. Negative emotions will only make us lose sleep, destroy the immune system, and create a miserable life. Forgiveness clears the fogginess of the mind, the way the sun chases away the mist. It enables you to see all the positive quality in the person who hurt you, qualities you loved once, and allows you to accept the good and bad traits of others, a foundation for a long-lasting, healthy relationship. Reconciliation through forgiveness is one of the foundations of the oneness of humanity. For an effective compromise, a crucial fact must be considered. Through empathy and compassion, the larger parts of the population has to recognize the suffering of the victims without dismissing them with stereotypes. In Canada, among the white population, there is a feeling of remorse, grief, and guilt related to past wrongdoings to the indigenous population, and a willingness to make things right. It takes many generations to harmonize disrupted societies. For example, in 1918, Toronto witnessed an anti-Greek riot for 3 days. Imagine. Throughout Ontario and Canada, Greek immigrants were targeted and falsely accused of not fighting in World War I. A century later, the annual event called the Taste of the Danforth happens with great expectations, and it is one of the greatest summer events in Toronto when Canadians of all colors, creeds, and sizes come together to celebrate Greek food, culture, and hospitality. Yes, oneness of humanity is possible as long as we promote inclusivity, diversity, and prosperity for all.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to more content on the Oneness Movement, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment. See you next time.